That obviously will be one of the conversations to be having. Interest rates, the NPR has been raised now to 18.5%. What can we expect following that? So we'll be having that conversation. But just before we go there, the African Development Bank has been meeting in Cairo, Egypt. And one of the topics there, a major one, according to the president, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, is developed nations not honoring $100 billion a year pledge, for climate change. And he believes that a lack of adequate financing for tackling climate change on the continent has become dire and is choking the continent. But let's have joining us from the location, that's Egypt, Professor Kevin Rama, is Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management with African Development Bank, joins us from Cairo now to bring us up to date on some of the conversations there. Professor Rama, good morning. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So the president, that's Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, is really, hot on this issue. And he's been talking about global financial architecture that seems to have failed Africa. Help us to understand his perspective to this. Hello, Professor Rama, can you hear me?
Architecture is failing Africa in several ways. If you just home into climate change, which is what we're talking about here, Africa needs about $2.7 trillion to implement climate change between now and 2030. But what Africa is receiving annually is very small compared to what it's supposed to be receiving in order to implement those agreements. So currently, the total, average annual climate financing required by Africa is around $242 billion annually between now and 2030, but Africa is receiving only $18.3 billion. So the financing gap is huge, and we continue to have what the president of the bank called yesterday megawatts of talk. We have several conferences of parties having discussions and promises, but as Kofi Annan always said, only the promises that are kept are the promises that matter. So that's just a call for the developed countries to honor their commitments under the Paris Agreement, under the climate agreements and other agreements that we have reached, so that they can make available the resources that is supposed to solve this global commons challenge we have on the continent.
So what's this costing Africa? What is the cost in real terms and in sectors and industry? What costs is it to the continent?
The cost of climate change to Africa is huge. As we estimated in our African Economic Outlook report of the year 2022, Africa is already losing 5 to 15% of its GDP per capita growth, gross domestic product per capita growth, because of the impacts of climate change. Changing weather events, floods, droughts, and other cyclones and other things are impacting several parts of the continent. Floods in Nigeria, for example, you will find a lot of damages to property, a lot of damages to lives and livelihoods that needs to be rebuilt with the limited fiscal space that these countries have. And you have different types of those challenges across the continent. And the frequency is also increasing. And as you know, Africa did not cause climate change. We have contributed only about 3% of the CO2 emissions that caused the climate change. But other countries have benefited in their own economic growth by actually emitting climate-forcing emissions that has created the problem. So because climate change is a global commons challenge, it then means that all actors involved need to come together to meet their commitments if we have to save the planet and keep the world going below the thresholds of temperature rises that is expected to become catastrophic for the world if we did not do that. So if you think about cost to lives and livelihoods, just think about 5% of GDP being lost, 15% of GDP being lost in different countries. On average, we are losing between 7 to 15 billion US dollars annually because of climate change-related losses and damages. and this will only continue to grow. And like I've mentioned, we require 2.7 trillion US dollars between now and 2030 to be able to implement the climate agreements that was mutually agreed in Paris during the climate COP in Paris. So it is just that responsibility that is required from every party to ensure that we do not allow countries who have not created the climate change to suffer it more. And think of it, our research also shows that countries that have more impacts of climate change, countries that are more vulnerable to climate change, do not receive climate finance. And that is why the president of the bank is saying, clamoring that climate finance is shortchanging Africa, because climate finance was created in order to help countries to adapt to climate emission, climate impacts. But our research have shown that countries that are more vulnerable to climate change are actually not receiving these climate finance. And a lot of those vulnerabilities to climate change are in Africa. Thank you.
All right, Professor Kevin Rama, thank you so much for that, Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management with African Development Bank. We wish you a success. We wish all of us success. I mean, we're all in Africa here, and we do feel those pinch from climate change. And the loss, I mean, putting the loss as between $7 and $15 billion annually is a huge loss to any continent and country. Thank you so much for your time. Wish you more success in your conversations there.
Thank you so much.